let's get started. See new video.
Lena stared at the blank page in front of her, the cursor blinking on the screen like a silent reminder that time was passing. She had a vision, a dream that she held onto fiercely when the world was quiet. She could almost see it, the books stacked neatly on a shelf in her future office, the accolades lining the walls, and her name appearing on the cover of the novel she had been dreaming of writing for years. She could see herself on stage, the crowd hanging on her every word as she spoke about how she built her career from the ground up. But today, as the weight of those aspirations pressed down on her, all she could feel was a deep, gnawing fatigue. Her body felt heavy, as though her dreams were tangible, and each one added another layer of exhaustion. She had set goals, written plans, and even promised herself this would be the year everything would fall into place. And yet, she hadn't written a single word in the past 3 days. Even when she tried, the words wouldn't come. "I should be further along by now," Lena muttered under her breath, closing her laptop with a snap. Her mind began to spiral, a familiar pattern she couldn't break. The big goals she had set seemed more like distant mountains, impossible to climb. Even though she knew she was capable, even though she could see the prize in the distance, something in her always seemed to stand in the way. Why do I feel so unmotivated even when I have big goals? It was a question that haunted her, plaguing her thoughts whenever she tried to push forward. Lena had always been someone who thrived on challenges. Growing up, she was taught that ambition was a badge of honor, that success came through persistence and effort. Her parents had drilled this into her as a child, praising her every achievement, no matter how small. But now, as an adult, those same words felt like a cruel echo in her mind, mocking her when things didn't go as planned. She remembered the last time she had sat down to write. The words had flowed effortlessly, and for a brief moment, she had felt like the writer she always wanted to be. But something changed after that. It was like a switch had been flipped. The next day, she found herself staring at the page again, and nothing came. She had sat there for hours, the blinking cursor mocking her every attempt. The ideas that once came easily were now tangled in knots, and every thought felt sluggish. Lena had always prided herself on being disciplined. She had set up routines, tracked her progress, and created an environment conducive to productivity. Yet, despite all her efforts, the motivation seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. Every time she thought she was getting back on track, a wave of apathy would pull her under again. She didn't know when it started, this feeling of being stuck. At first, it was subtle, just a day or two of inertia. But soon, it became a week, then 2, and the guilt grew. It wasn't as if she didn't want to work on her goals. She wanted them desperately. She dreamed of success, of seeing her work come to life. But the energy to take action seemed to vanish whenever she tried to put her plans into motion. "What's wrong with me?" she whispered aloud, sitting back in her chair and staring at the ceiling. It wasn't the first time she'd asked herself that question. She had been here before, in this emotional desert where she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't create. It was as though something invisible held her back, like an unseen force that tugged at her whenever she tried to break free from the pull of inertia. The pressure to succeed, to meet her own expectations, was overwhelming. But it wasn't the pressure alone that kept her from moving forward. It was the fear of failure, and the fear of success. Both seemed to paralyze her in equal measure. The dream of finishing her novel was beautiful, but the reality of putting in the work to get there felt daunting. What if she wasn't good enough? What if her work didn't live up to the expectations she had set for herself? What if she failed? But at the same time, the fear of success gnawed at her as well. What if she did finish her book? What if it became successful beyond her wildest dreams? Could she handle the attention, the scrutiny, the constant pressure to repeat that success? What if success changed everything and everyone around her? The dual fears were like chains, binding her to a state of indecision and inaction. She had grown so accustomed to this internal battle that it felt like a part of her routine. This constant tug-of-war between her desire to achieve and the internal obstacles that made it feel impossible. She wanted to understand why she felt like this, why the motivation she once had disappeared, even when she knew her goals were still important to her. She tried reading self-help books, listening to podcasts about productivity, and even meditating to clear her mind. But nothing worked. It was like a fog that clouded her every thought, making it hard to see the way forward. She rubbed her temples, trying to stave off the growing headache that came with this mental exhaustion. She felt tired, but it wasn't just physical fatigue. It was a deeper weariness, a fatigue of the soul. I should be doing more, she thought, her frustration rising. I've got big goals. I want to achieve them. So why can't I just do it? She sighed, glancing at the calendar on her wall. Another day gone by. Another day where she had promised herself she would make progress, but hadn't. She stared at the goals she had set for herself. Finish the first draft of her novel by the end of the month, complete the research for a side project, and get back to her regular exercise routine. She had everything mapped out, everything planned. So why was she still standing still? Lena knew the answer. It wasn't a lack of planning or a lack of desire. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. But she was determined to figure it out. Because if she didn't, the dreams she had worked so hard to build would remain just that, dreams. But how could she move forward when she didn't even know why she was stuck in the first place? The next morning, Lena woke up to the soft glow of the sun peeking through the curtains. The air was fresh, carrying a hint of spring, a new beginning. She felt a flicker of hope. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today she would break free from the cycle of stagnation that had wrapped itself around her life. She stretched and made her way to the kitchen to brew her coffee. The routine felt comforting, a small victory. She had always been someone who thrived in structure, who found solace in the predictable. But even as the aroma of the freshly brewed coffee filled the room, the familiar weight of her goals, the ones that had once inspired her, began to settle on her chest again. Sitting at the kitchen table with her cup in hand, Lena took a deep breath. Why was she still unmotivated? She had spent so much time over the past few weeks trying to push through, trying to force herself into action, but it never seemed to work. She felt like she was chasing something just out of reach. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up automatically, expecting it to be a message from her friend, Anna. She smiled as she saw the text, but the smile quickly faded when she read the message. How's the writing going? I hope you're making progress. I know you've got this. Lena stared at the message, feeling a mix of guilt and frustration. Anna was always so supportive, so positive. But instead of feeling motivated by her words, Lena felt a sting in her chest. She wasn't making progress, not in the way she had promised herself she would. Lena set the phone down and closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of Anna's message or just the sheer accumulation of all the days she hadn't been able to write. But the emotions were bubbling to the surface. Why did she feel this way? She had the passion, the skills, the desire. But something inside her was holding her back, stopping her from taking that first step, from doing what she knew deep down she was capable of. She realized then that it wasn't the lack of discipline that was keeping her stuck. It was fear. Fear of failure, yes, but also fear of success. Fear of what would happen once she reached her goal. Fear that she would no longer recognize herself in the midst of her own achievements. Lena's fingers tightened around her coffee mug, and a sense of clarity began to form. She had been trying to push through her fear, thinking that if she just worked harder, she could overcome it. But maybe that wasn't the solution. Maybe the fear wasn't something she could simply work past. Maybe it was something she needed to understand first. She pulled out a journal from the drawer next to her, the pages filled with half-written thoughts and unfinished sentences. Opening it to a blank page, she took a deep breath and began to write. I've been afraid of failure for so long, but I've also been afraid of what success would mean. It's like if I succeed, everything changes. People will expect more from me, and I'll have to live up to their expectations. What if I don't want that? What if I just want to write, to create, without the pressure of being good enough? The words flowed as she continued to write, each sentence uncovering layers of doubt and fear she hadn't realized were there. It was like she was finally giving herself permission to admit the things she had been too afraid to acknowledge. The fear wasn't just about failing. It was about losing the freedom she associated with her creative process. She was terrified that success would trap her in a box where she had to constantly meet other people's standards. But at the same time, Lena knew that if she didn't face this fear, it would continue to hold her back. She had been hiding behind her goals, telling herself that if she worked hard enough, things would just magically click. But the truth was, the fear was always there, lurking in the background, keeping her stuck in a cycle of procrastination and self-doubt. Lena's eyes filled with tears as she wrote, the emotions spilling out in a raw, cathartic release. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was starting to understand why she felt so unmotivated despite her big goals. It wasn't a lack of desire or drive. It was the fear of what would happen once she succeeded, once she reached the place she had dreamed of for so long. Her hand shook as she wrote the final sentence in her journal. "I'm scared that if I succeed, I will lose myself." As she finished writing, a strange sense of calm washed over her. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a breakthrough. For the first time, Lena felt like she was confronting the root of her struggle, not just the symptoms. The fear that had held her back wasn't something she could ignore any longer. It was something she had to face head-on. She closed the journal and took another sip of her coffee, feeling the weight of her emotions settle. It wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it would probably be a long journey of untangling the knots of fear and doubt that had formed over the years. But at least now, she understood why she felt the way she did. Lena set her mug down and stood up, stretching her arms above her head. She wasn't ready to dive into her novel just yet. She still needed time to process everything she had uncovered. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of motivation. It wasn't the kind of motivation that came from a to-do list or a deadline. It was the kind of motivation that came from understanding herself a little better, from giving herself the space to feel what she needed to feel. She wasn't going to rush. She was going to take things one step at a time, learning to confront her fears instead of running from them. She knew now that it wasn't about forcing herself to work harder. It was about working through the things that had held her back for so long. As she walked to her desk and opened her laptop, Lena didn't feel the usual pressure to produce. She simply felt the quiet resolve to keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps. The goals were still there, still important, but they no longer felt like impossible mountains. Now, they felt like challenges she was ready to face, on her own terms. It had been a few weeks since Lena had that breakthrough moment with her journal. The weight of her fears hadn't disappeared overnight, but something had shifted inside her. She didn't have all the answers yet, but the pressure to be perfect had begun to fade. She had allowed herself to acknowledge the fears that had held her back for so long, and in doing so, she started to release their grip on her. Her mornings had taken on a different rhythm. Instead of waking up with a sense of dread about the work she wasn't doing, Lena now started each day with a quiet reflection. She spent a few minutes journaling, letting her thoughts flow without judgment. Sometimes she would write about her fears, other times about her dreams, but always about what was true for her in the moment. That simple practice had become a lifeline, a way to reconnect with herself before the demands of the day took over. Writing had become less about reaching a destination and more about allowing herself the space to create, without the constant pressure of perfection. The fear of success still lingered, but it no longer paralyzed her. She had come to realize that success didn't mean she had to give up her freedom or become someone else. It was possible to be successful and still be true to herself. As for her novel, it had slowly begun to take shape. Lena no longer stared at the screen in frustration, paralyzed by the fear of not being good enough. Instead, she wrote a few paragraphs a day, no matter how imperfect they were. Sometimes the words flowed easily, other times they came in hesitant bursts, but the key was that she kept showing up. She stopped trying to force herself into some idealized version of the perfect writer and simply allowed herself to be who she was in the moment, a writer who was still learning, still growing. It was on one of those mornings, as she sat at her desk, fingers hovering above the keyboard, that Lena finally realized something important. Her goals, the ones that had once seemed so distant and unattainable, no longer had the same weight. They were still important to her, but they no longer defined her. What mattered now was the journey, one step at a time, one word at a time. It was no longer about the destination. It was about embracing the process. Progress isn't always linear, she whispered to herself, a mantra she had started repeating whenever she felt the familiar doubt creeping in. She didn't have to be perfect, and she didn't have to be constantly moving forward at breakneck speed. What mattered was that she was moving, in her own way, at her own pace. One afternoon, as she walked in the park, Lena thought back to her original question. Why do I feel so unmotivated even when I have big goals? She realized that the answer wasn't as simple as just being afraid of failure or success. It wasn't just about procrastination or perfectionism. It was about the pressure she had placed on herself to achieve everything all at once, to meet expectations that were not her own. Lena had spent so long looking at her goals as a checklist of achievements, as if ticking off boxes was the key to happiness. But now, she understood that true fulfillment didn't come from completing goals. It came from embracing the journey of growth, the messy, imperfect process of learning and evolving. The motivation she had been searching for wasn't something to be forced. It was something to be cultivated from within, by giving herself the permission to be human, to make mistakes, to take breaks, and to celebrate every small victory along the way. That evening, after dinner, Lena sat down at her desk again. The light in the room was soft and warm, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the weight of her goals pressing down on her. Instead, she felt an ease in her chest, a quiet confidence that no matter where the journey took her, she would be okay. She would get there, not in a straight line, but by staying true to herself and her own pace. As her fingers danced across the keys, Lena felt a sense of peace. She didn't have to write the perfect novel. She didn't have to meet anyone else's expectations. She only had to show up and do the work, no matter how small the steps. For the first time in months, she felt motivated, not because of some distant, grand goal, but because she was doing what she loved. She was writing, creating, and learning. And that, in itself, was enough. Lena closed her laptop that night, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known in a long time. She had learned something profound about herself, something that would continue to guide her as she moved forward. It wasn't about the destination. It was about showing up, being present, and honoring her own journey. And as she drifted off to sleep, a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Her dreams were still there, waiting for her, but now, they didn't seem so unreachable. She was no longer trapped by the weight of expectations. She had found a way to move forward, one imperfect, beautiful step at a time.